On May 12, 1985, the Seafield family noticed that their neighbors had not left their house for several days. Bob Seafield decided to check to see if they were okay, and as he approached their window, he heard a baby screaming. When the officers arrived and entered the house, they were horrified by what they saw. Catherine Jean Furnish, known to those close to her as Kathy, was born on October 29, 1953, in Kansas City, Missouri, United States. She was the daughter of Jane Furnish and Eugene Furnish, had two sisters, Susan and Patricia, and a brother, Timothy. In the 70s, Catherine found her love at a single softball game when Gary Eastburn saw her and fell madly in love. They began dating almost immediately. In 1975, when the young man was about to enlist in the U.S. Air Force, they decided to get married. After 3 years, on May 21, 1979, the Eastburns had their first child, Kara Sue. Then, on November 17, 1981, Erin Nicole was born. And finally, in 1983, the family grew again with the addition of Jana. Gary was a captain in the Air Force, and that same year he was assigned to Pope Air Force Base as an air traffic control supervisor. The family subsequently settled in Fayetteville, North Carolina. 2 years later, Gary was selected to be an air communications officer at a base near London. Prior to this, he was required to attend a 10-week officer training course at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery. Originally, the Eastburns planned to move to Alabama together while the man attended the training. However, it was later decided that it was better for Katie to stay in Fayetteville with the girls. This allowed them not to face 2 moves in a row, and Kara could continue to attend daycare regularly. It would also help the mother get busy preparing for the upcoming international move. In addition to members of the Eastburn family, this story features Timothy Belly Hennis, a man born February 24, 1950. He grew up in the city of Rochester, Minnesota. In the year 80, Timothy went into the Army. And 5 years later, when the events that are about to be discussed took place, the 27-year-old soldier had the rank of sergeant and was working as a parachute installer. He was married to a woman named Angela, and his first daughter, Christina, had just been born. The Eastburns and Timothy's stories crossed on Tuesday, May 7, 1985, when he responded to an ad Catherine had placed in the local paper, offering to foster Dixie, the family dog. Under the rules of moving to London, they couldn't take the dog with them, and the thought of having to find a new home for her was very hard. But they were confident they could find a loving family who would care for her and make her happy. The publication coincided with a search that Hanice's family was conducting. They had a dog who wouldn't accept their newborn baby, and they wanted a dog adapted to socializing with children. That Tuesday, Catherine invited Timothy to her home, and after exchanging pleasantries, he took Dixie to see if she would fit in with his family. By this time, Gary had been at Maxwell Base for 9 weeks. As is customary for spouses accustomed to long separations, due to the captain's business trips, husband and wife maintained regular communication through letters and weekly calls. But on Saturday, May 11th, the day scheduled for such communication, Gary did not receive a call from Catherine. Moreover, all of the man's subsequent attempts to speak with his wife were unsuccessful. The man realized something was wrong and called the Fayetteville Police Department. Officers responded to the call and went to the man's home, but no one answered the door, and they noticed the lights in the house were off. Before leaving, they left a note for the homeowner asking her to contact her husband. On Sunday, May 12th, which was Mother's Day, the Eastburns' neighbors, Sergeant Bob Seafield and his wife, noticed newspapers piled up outside the house. Thinking back over the past few days, they realized that Catherine's car hadn't been touched in days, and the stroller was parked by the back door as usual. Bob decided to investigate, and although no one answered the knocking and ringing of the doorbell, he thought he heard a baby crying coming from behind the door. So he went home and called the Eastburns' nanny, Julie Cherniak, who arrived on the scene very quickly. She looked out the window and saw Jana. She was lying in her crib with her arms outstretched. The woman tried to go into the house to get the baby, but Bob convinced her not to and to wait for the police. The first police officer to arrive on the scene, William Toman, opened a window in the baby's room and handed him to Bob along with a diaper. He asked the neighbor to wait outside while he searched the house, as there was a very strong odor inside and he had to check what was causing it. Once the officer moved on, he discovered the lifeless bodies of Catherine and Erin and decided to call for backup. Upon further inspection, Kara's remains were also discovered. While police cordoned off the scene, Jana was being cared for at the Seafield home. The girl was desperate, crying and covered in feces. The doctors who treated her determined that she was severely dehydrated and said that her condition was so severe that if she did not get help, she would die. 31-year-old Catherine, whose body was found without pants or underwear with a torn blouse and bra, had multiple stab wounds and had been sexually assaulted. 3-year-old Erin was in her parents' bedroom. She also had stab wounds and blunt force trauma to her chest and back. 5-year-old Kara was found in her bed as if she was hiding under a blanket. She also had various injuries to her chest. All 3 victims had their throats slit. Police determined that Jana had been in her crib for 3 days before neighbors found her. They also concluded that the perpetrator did not take her life because there was no risk that she would recognize him. Experts took samples from both the scene and the victims' bodies. Among the evidence were strands of hair, fingerprints, traces of blood, and seminal fluid. The latter was discovered during the examination of Catherine's body. Experts noted that there was little blood at the scene given the severity of the injuries. However, a luminol test revealed that someone had weeped blood on the walls and in the bathroom. Detective Jack Watts took it upon himself to contact Gary and inform him of what had happened to his family. When the phone rang in the bedroom, the captain thought he would finally hear his wife's voice. But as soon as he was informed that a detective was calling, he prepared for the worst. Picking up the phone, he identified the caller and asked how many were dead. The officer replied that he could not give him that information over the phone, but there had been a tragedy in his family and he should return immediately. That same evening, Gary boarded his plane, not knowing what awaited him. As soon as he arrived in Fayetteville, he learned that someone had taken the lives of his wife and his 2 daughters. In that moment, the realization that Jana had survived gave him the strength to move on with his life. Gary was extremely depressed when detectives took his statement. He was initially considered a suspect, but it was soon discovered that he had traveled to Alabama weeks before the crime. From the information Gary shared, what caught the investigators' attention the most was the posting of an ad looking for a home for the dog and the visit that Catherine received on the 7th. Gary said that in the letter, his wife informed him that a very kind man had taken the dog in hopes that it would be able to adapt to his family. After taking a statement from the Air Force captain, they took him home to help them determine if any items were missing. Gary reported that Catherine's bank card and a piece of paper with her password were missing. Also, missing was an envelope containing approximately $300. While investigators were determining the identity of the assailant, they were approached by Patrick Cohn, 20, who provided information he thought might be of interest. He said that on Friday evening, May 10th, he saw a man leaving the Eastburn home. It was on that day that police believe the tragedy occurred. According to Patrick, around 3:30 Friday morning, while driving home, he saw a white Chevrolet parked in the driveway and a man leaving the house. The witness explained that he was in close proximity to the man and described him in great detail. According to him, he was white, tall, with blonde hair, a wide nose, and a mustache. He also indicated that the man was wearing a black jacket over a white shirt and blue jeans. In addition, he noted that he was holding a trash bag. Investigators asked the young man to help create a sketch of the suspect. Authorities then released a sketch and description of the man. In addition, a call was made for the man who responded to Catherine's ad for the dog to contact police. The notification by the authorities had the expected effect. Timothy Hennis was sitting at home watching the news with his wife when he saw the ad. He was shocked to see that he was the man who not only answered the ad, but also bore a striking resemblance to the man pictured. The sergeant immediately left his home with his wife and daughter and drove his white Chevrolet to the police department where he offered to help in any way he could. Timothy answered all questions for nearly 7 hours without an attorney present and never asked for one. In recounting how his encounter with Catherine on the 7th occurred, he said that he parked his car at his home around 9 p.m. and walked up the driveway holding a leash. According to him, upon knocking on the door, he encountered a woman who invited him in. Continuing his story, the sergeant reported that Catherine told him that she had just put her 3 young daughters to bed and began introducing him to Dixie. Timothy added that he liked the dog but wanted to see if she would get along with his Spitz, so he agreed to take her home with his wife and daughter and keep in touch with her. Investigators determined that the crimes were committed between Thursday evening and early Friday morning. It was on the 10th that newspapers began piling up on the porch of the house. In addition, neighbors had seen her earlier on the 9th. Given this evidence, the officers asked Timothy to describe his actions that evening. He said he drove his wife and daughter to a relative's house and then returned home. The officers handling the case asked the suspect to give hair, blood and seminal fluid samples, but the results did not link Timothy to the case. He then held a lineup, which was attended by several people with similar physical features. Patrick didn't hesitate to identify him. From that point on, the investigation focused on the sergeant, and detectives began interviewing his neighborhood. Neighbors said they saw him burning things in a barrel near the house and were there for 5 hours, working on the fire. This caught their attention as they had never seen him doing such an activity before. The dry cleaners also reported that the suspect took his jacket to the laundry the day after the crime was committed. Another important piece of information was provided by the owner of the house where the Hennesses lived. He said that Timothy, who owed him $350 in rent, repaid the debt immediately after the incident. After the interrogations, Timothy and Angela thought they would never get to the police again, but they were wrong. After obtaining an arrest warrant, detectives showed up at their home to arrest the sergeant for sexual assault and first-degree murder against Catherine and her 2 daughters. During the investigation, a witness named Lucilla Cook came forward and provided information linking the defendant to the use of the victim's debit card. Investigators determined that the card, stolen from the scene, was used at 10:54 p.m. on May 10 and 8:56 a.m. on May 11. According to the woman, she used the ATM just before a tall, blonde-haired man wearing camouflage pants then drove away in a light-colored vehicle. The timing given by the witness coincides with the aforementioned banking transactions. Detectives linked the $300 cash withdrawal to the rent delinquency I mentioned above. Timothy hired a prestigious law firm and was represented by Gerald Beaver and Billy Richardson, who were considered the best attorneys in North Carolina. Prosecutors offered Timothy's defense a plea deal to 2 counts of second-degree murder, with a likely sentence of 2 consecutive life sentences. But he refused, saying he would not plead guilty to something he did not commit. The defense sought to discredit the testimony of one of the prosecution's key witnesses. To do so, they recreated the moment Patrick crossed paths with a man he identified as Timothy. They went to the Eastburn house at the same time to ensure the same lighting and fog conditions. The person playing the role of witness did not see the suspect during the reconstruction. The defense got an additional element during the scene examination. A neighbor approached them and said that on the night of the crime, he saw a van parked outside the family's home and saw a white male with a short haircut who was with friends. A second reconstruction was subsequently conducted with Patrick, who concluded that he may have been mistaken in his identification. The defense attorneys then turned to a prosecution witness, Lucille, a woman who claimed to have seen the suspect at the ATM. During questioning, she changed her story and stated that she had not seen anyone that day. The first trial against Timothy began in 1986, about 12 months after the triple murders. The prosecution built its case on circumstantial evidence without any physical evidence linking the sergeant to the murders. One hypothesis was that Catherine had rejected Timothy's offer of intimacy, in response to which he sexually assaulted her, and then decided to end her life and the lives of her daughters so they would not recognize him. During the trial, the prosecutor told the jury that what happened at the Eastburn home was utter madness and could be considered one of the most tragic events that had occurred in the country up to that point. His words were accompanied by a display of dozens of gruesome crime scene photos. Patrick was the main witness called by the prosecution in front of the jury. He identified the defendant as the man he saw leaving the Eastburn home in the early morning hours of May 10, 1985. On July 4, 1986, after 10 hours of deliberation, a jury found Timothy guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree sexual assault. 4 days later, on July 8th, he was sentenced to death and transferred to death row at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. But this was only the end of the first chapter in a long trial, and Timothy's defense remained determined to prove his innocence. In 1988, his attorneys appealed to the North Carolina Supreme Court, citing inconsistencies in the investigation, false testimony, suppression of evidence, and improper display of graphic material that influenced the jury's guilty verdict. As a result, the judges ruled in favor of Timothy, overturning the previous trial and starting a new one that began in April 1989. The defense focused on discrediting Patrick, arguing that his testimony during the first trial was inaccurate. In this case, new witnesses came forward on Timothy's side, including a newspaper delivery woman who testified that on the day of the accident at 1:45 a.m., she saw a long-haired man driving a light-colored van in front of the Eastburn's home. In the same vein, the defense called as a witness a tall, blonde-haired teenager named John Raupow, who said that he regularly walked near the Eastburn home late at night and admitted that he passed there around 3 a.m. on May 10, 1985. He also indicated that he used to wear a cap and had a black jacket similar to the one the suspect was wearing. This testimony allowed the defense to argue that Patrick could have seen John on that fateful day and raised reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury as to Timothy's guilt. The defense also pointed out that the shoe prints found outside the Eastburn home were 3 sizes smaller than those worn by the defendant. It was also pointed out that the blood sample taken from the towel did not match the defendant's blood sample. Further evidence was an anonymous letter processed by the post office on the same day of the conviction. The letter apologized to Timothy and accepted responsibility for the crimes committed. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and after 2 days of deliberation, the jury voted in favor of the defendant, who was acquitted of all charges. Timothy walked out of the courtroom a free man. He re-enlisted in the Army, and in 1998 the man moved with his wife and children to Fort Lewis, Washington. After the first trial, Gary moved on with his life because he had Jana to take care of. Although he canceled a move to London after the tragic deaths of his wife and 2 daughters, he decided in 1988 that it was time for a change of scenery. He was in England when he was informed that he had to return to the United States for a retrial. After that trial ended, he traveled back to England where he fell in love and married an Air Force nurse. In 1998, Gary returned to his homeland and settled in a town 20 kilometers from Fort Lewis. In 2005, the Eastburn family murder was presented as an unsolved case at a seminar for detectives on advanced criminal intelligence techniques. There, Larry Trotter, a homicide detective from Cumberland County, heard that seminal fluid samples had been taken at the time, which, at the time, yielded no matches. However, given advances in DNA analysis, further testing may have led to an identification of the perpetrator. Larry then learned that the sheriff's office was storing these samples and retrieved them. He sent the samples to the State Bureau of Investigation lab, and a year later, the results came back. Along with the results came the answer everyone was waiting for. The DNA profile matched that of Timothy Belly Hennis. What's more, according to the forensic scientist who conducted the study, the sample was 1 billion times more likely to be Timothy's than any other North Carolina resident. Larry shared this find with District Attorney Robert Battle, who in turn contacted Gary. They always had the right person and finally had a way to prove it. The DA decided to turn the case over to the legal team at Fort Bragg, who presented the case file to the military base commander general. The commander demanded that Timothy be called to active duty so that he could be charged with 3 counts of murder and court-martialed. On September 26, 2006, a military lawyer, a Fort Bragg CID officer, and 2 police officers went to Timothy's home and handed him a letter ordering him to report to base within 30 days. The man reported for duty and, despite the charges against him, began working part-time in the office, receiving pay and benefits. Timothy's court-martial took place on March 17, 2010, 21 years after his acquittal. It was presided over by Colonel Patrick Parrish. One of the prosecutors noted that the only difference between the previous trials and the court-martial was the new DNA evidence. Among the prosecution's evidence were photographs taken at the scene of the crime, as well as a series of photos provided by Gary showing his daughters and his smiling wife. After a 3-week trial, the defendant was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to death on April 15, 2010. Timothy Hennis was dishonorably discharged from the Army and confined to the disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. Upon learning of the sentence, Gary stated that he did not believe Timothy's days were numbered, as the last execution in the Army took place in 1961. Friends, what do you think about this story? A very interesting case with unexpected plot twists. Write your opinion in the comments, as well as subscribe to the channel. See you soon in new videos.